Chapter 1. The Message. Rowan Hale always believed that silence could be louder than an argument. On a cold November evening in Portland, Oregon, that belief settled heavily in his chest as he stood alone in the kitchen of the townhouse he shared with his husband, Callum Voss. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the clock above the stove crept toward 8 o'clock. Dinner had already gone cold. The roasted chicken sat untouched. The candles Rowan had lit nearly an hour earlier had burned low enough to leave thin streams of wax along the table. None of that surprised him anymore. Callum had been arriving home late for months. At first there had been explanations, then apologies, then simple text messages. Eventually there had been nothing at all. Rowan picked up the plates and carried them toward the sink when a vibration echoed across the marble countertop. Callum's phone. He had forgotten it. That alone was unusual. Callum never forgot his phone. Rowan glanced at the screen only because he thought it might be important. A message had appeared. The sender's name was hidden behind a company contact title, but the words were visible before the screen dimmed. Just a few more months. Then I am done. Rowan froze. His hand tightened around the plate he was holding. For a moment he simply stared. The sentence was short, simple, direct. Yet it felt as if all the air had vanished from the room. Just a few more months. Then I am done. He read it again, and again. His reflections stared back from the dark screen after it locked. Somewhere deep inside himself, a painful understanding began to take shape. The distance, the secrecy, the late nights, the guarded expressions, the way Callum no longer looked at him across the dinner table. The way conversations had become schedules and reminders instead of shared dreams. Rowan remembered a different version of their life. 5 years earlier they had met at a charity art exhibition downtown. Callum had been quiet but attentive. Rowan had spent the entire evening laughing. 1 year later they married beneath a grove of cedar trees on the Oregon coast. They had promised honesty. They had promised partnership. They had promised forever. But forever suddenly felt fragile. Rowan placed the plate carefully into the sink. His heartbeat was steady, strangely calm. That frightened him more than panic would have. He carried the phone to the living room and set it beside Callum's laptop. Then his eyes landed on a calendar resting near the bookshelf. Several dates months ahead had been circled in black ink. One date had been marked more heavily than the others. Rowan stared at it for a long moment. A countdown. That was what it looked like. A countdown to an ending. His ending. Their ending. He sank onto the couch and looked around the house they had built together. Every photograph on the walls suddenly felt like evidence from another life. Yet no tears came. Only clarity. If Callum was counting the months until he could walk away, Rowan would not force him to stay. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Inside, Rowan made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. By the time Callum returned home that night, something invisible had already begun to break. The next morning arrived gray and cold. Rowan barely slept. He lay awake listening to the rain fade into silence and then return again before dawn. Beside him, Callum's side of the bed remained untouched. Sometime after midnight, he had heard the front door open and close, followed by the distant sound of a shower. Callum never came upstairs. That hurt more than Rowan wanted to admit. By 7 o'clock, the townhouse felt strangely empty even though another person was inside it. Rowan stood in the kitchen holding a coffee mug between both hands. Through the window, he watched a delivery truck move slowly down the street. Life continued exactly as it had the day before. Cars passed. Neighbors walked their dogs. Somewhere nearby, a lawn mower started. Yet inside Rowan's chest, everything felt different. He heard footsteps behind him. Callum entered the kitchen dressed for work, wearing a charcoal coat and carrying a leather briefcase. He looked tired. There were faint shadows beneath his eyes. "Morning," Callum said. Rowan turned. "Morning." The conversation ended there. Callum opened the refrigerator, grabbed a bottle of water, and checked his phone. Rowan noticed how quickly his expression changed when he read something on the screen. Concern. Then relief. Then the familiar wall returned. Big meeting today? Rowan asked. Something like that. Callum slipped the phone into his pocket. I might be late again. Rowan nodded. He had expected that answer. What surprised him was how little it affected him now. A few days earlier, he would have asked questions. He would have tried to save the conversation. This morning, he simply accepted it. Callum stepped closer and rested a hand briefly on Rowan's shoulder. The gesture felt automatic, almost rehearsed. Everything okay? He asked. Rowan looked at him carefully. 5 years together had taught him every expression on Callum's face. The problem was that recently Callum seemed determined to hide all of them. I am fine, Rowan said. Callum studied him for a second, as if sensing something was different, but his phone vibrated again. The moment disappeared. I have to go. Rowan watched him leave. Seconds later, an engine started outside. Then silence returned. He stood alone in the kitchen until his coffee turned cold. Around noon, Rowan began cleaning the upstairs guest room. It was not really cleaning. It was searching for something to do. His thoughts kept returning to the message and the marked date on the calendar. Eventually, he opened a closet near the end of the hallway. Most of the shelves contained storage boxes and old holiday decorations. But on the highest shelf sat a small black lockbox. Rowan frowned. He had never seen it before. Carefully, he carried it downstairs and placed it on the dining room table. The box was surprisingly heavy. There was no key attached. No label. Nothing except a combination lock on the front. His pulse quickened. He hesitated before lifting it. Something shifted inside. Papers. Multiple papers. Rowan stared at the box for a long time. Then he noticed something else. Taped beneath the handle was a small white envelope. His name was written across the front in Callum's handwriting. Rowan's breath caught. For several seconds, he could do nothing except stare at those 5 letters. Rowan. Whatever was hidden inside that box, Callum had never intended for him to find it this way. Rowan sat motionless at the dining room table while the afternoon light slowly shifted across the hardwood floor. The small white envelope remained untouched in front of him. His name, written in Callum's familiar handwriting, seemed to carry more weight than the lockbox itself. For several minutes he simply stared at it, fighting the urge to open it immediately. Part of him wanted answers. Another part was afraid of what those answers might confirm. Eventually, he slid a finger beneath the seal and carefully unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The note was short. Rowan, if you found this earlier than expected, it means I made a mistake. Please do not open the box yet. Not until the date marked on the calendar. Trust me a little longer. Love, Callum. Rowan read the message twice. Then a third time. His chest tightened. Trust me a little longer. The words should have comforted him. Instead, they only deepened the confusion. For months, trust was exactly what had been disappearing from their marriage. He folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. The lockbox sat silently between his hands. Whatever was hidden inside was clearly important. Important enough that Callum had prepared it months in advance. Important enough to keep secret. Rowan glanced toward the calendar hanging near the living room bookshelf. The heavily marked date was still nearly 4 months away. For months, the same amount of time mentioned in the text message. Just a few more months. Then I am done. The coincidence felt impossible to ignore. A cold realization settled over him. Whatever Callum was planning would end on that date. Maybe the box contained financial documents. Maybe divorce papers. Maybe instructions for dividing their lives apart. The possibilities chased one another through his mind. By early evening, Rowan found himself driving through downtown Portland without a destination. The city lights reflected off damp streets left behind by the morning rain. He passed the art gallery where he and Callum had first met years ago. The building looked exactly the same. Through the large front windows, he could see visitors wandering between exhibits. He remembered how nervous Callum had seemed that night. How he had spent nearly 10 minutes pretending to study a painting before finally introducing himself. Rowan smiled despite himself. Back then, Callum had never hidden what he felt. Somewhere along the way, that openness had vanished. His phone buzzed. A message from Callum appeared on the screen. "Working late again. Do not wait up." Rowan stared at the words. No explanation. No details. Just another delay. Almost automatically, he opened their message history. Weeks of brief conversations filled the screen. Grocery lists, schedule changes, reminders, practical things. The kind of messages exchanged by roommates rather than husbands. He suddenly noticed something else. Over the past several months, Callum had stopped making plans beyond that marked date. No vacations. No holiday discussions. No future projects. Everything ended before then. Rowan's stomach twisted. When he finally returned home, darkness had settled over the neighborhood. The townhouse stood quiet beneath the glow of a porch light. Inside, he carried the lockbox upstairs and placed it in the back of a closet. Then he pulled an empty suitcase from storage and set it on the bedroom floor. He did not begin packing. Not yet. But for the first time, the possibility felt real. Downstairs, a car door closed outside. Callum had come home. Rowan looked at the suitcase, then toward the hallway. Somewhere deep inside, a decision was beginning to take shape, and once it was made, there would be no easy way back. Chapter 2. The Countdown. Callum Voss knew something was wrong the moment he stepped through the front door. The townhouse looked exactly the same. The lights were on. Rowan's coat still hung beside the entryway. A soft jazz playlist drifted from the living room speaker. Nothing appeared unusual. Yet a strange tension settled over him immediately, the same instinctive feeling that had helped him navigate high-stakes negotiations for years. He loosened his tie and walked into the kitchen. Rowan stood by the sink staring out the window at the dark street beyond. "Hey," Callum said gently. Rowan turned and offered a small smile. It was polite. Too polite. Callum felt his stomach tighten. Rowan had always smiled with his eyes. This smile never reached them. "Long day?" Rowan asked. "You could say that." Callum set his briefcase down. "How was yours?" "Quiet." Another short answer. Another wall. Callum studied him carefully. Over the past several months, he had become painfully aware of every shift in Rowan's mood. The problem was that he could never explain why he had been acting the way he was. Not yet. Every promise he had made depended on keeping certain things hidden a little longer. Just a few more months. That was all he needed. For months, and everything would finally be ready. For months, and Rowan would understand. At least that was what Callum kept telling himself. During dinner, the silence between them felt heavier than usual. Rowan barely touched his food. He answered questions with one or two words. Several times Callum caught him watching from across the table, as if trying to solve a puzzle. Finally, Rowan spoke. "Do you ever think about the future?" The question caught Callum off guard. "Of course." "Past this year." Callum hesitated, only for a second. But Rowan noticed. Rowan always noticed. "Why are you asking?" Callum replied. Rowan lowered his gaze toward his plate. "No reason." The conversation ended there, but unease lingered. Later that night, after Rowan went upstairs, Callum remained alone in his office. The room overlooked the backyard. Rainwater still glistened on the cedar fence beneath the security lights. He opened a secure folder on his laptop and reviewed a long checklist. Financial transfers, property documents, legal paperwork, medical appointments, insurance records. Nearly every item had already been completed. A rare feeling of relief touched him. Everything was finally falling into place. His phone buzzed. A new message appeared from Dr. Evelyn Mercer. "The latest results are available. Call me tomorrow." Callum stared at the screen. His chest tightened. For several moments, he simply sat there in silence. Then he locked the phone and leaned back in his chair. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked softly. Rowan was still awake. Callum glanced toward the ceiling. He wanted nothing more than to go upstairs, sit beside his husband, and tell him everything. The fears, the plans, the reasons behind every secret. But if he told Rowan now, the entire purpose of what he had spent months preparing would disappear. Across the house, Rowan stood quietly in the hallway outside the office door. Through the narrow opening, he had only seen one thing before stepping back into the shadows. A message on Callum's screen. The name of a woman, Dr. Evelyn Mercer. Rowan closed his eyes. Another piece of the puzzle had just fallen into place, and unfortunately, it seemed to confirm every fear he already carried. The following morning, Rowan could not stop thinking about the name he had seen on Callum's phone. Dr. Evelyn Mercer. He told himself it meant nothing. People met doctors every day. There could be countless explanations. Yet after months of secrecy, late nights, hidden messages, and that mysterious countdown on the calendar, his mind naturally connected the pieces in the most painful way possible. By late afternoon, Rowan found himself sitting inside a small coffee shop across from one of Portland's largest private medical centers. The decision had not been planned. He had simply driven there after seeing the address listed online beneath Dr. Evelyn Mercer's professional profile. Rain drifted softly across the parking lot while patients moved in and out of the glass entrance. Rowan wrapped both hands around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He felt foolish for being there. He felt guilty. Most of all, he felt desperate. Around 5 o'clock, a black sedan pulled into the reserved parking area near the front entrance. Rowan immediately recognized it. Callum stepped out wearing the same dark overcoat he had left home in that morning. Rowan's heart sank. He watched as Callum checked his watch and entered the building without hesitation. 20 minutes later, another figure emerged from the entrance beside him. A woman. Tall, professional, elegant. She appeared to be in her early 40s. Her dark coat moved in the wind as she and Callum stood beneath the awning speaking quietly. Rowan could not hear a single word. He only saw Callum smile. It was not a large smile. It was brief, but it was real. More real than any smile Rowan had received in months. Something inside him cracked. The woman handed Callum a folder. He accepted it and nodded. Then, to Rowan's growing disbelief, she placed a comforting hand on his shoulder for a moment before walking back inside. The gesture lasted only seconds. Yet from across the street it looked intimate, familiar, personal. Rowan stared through the rain-speckled window until Callum drove away. The logical part of his mind told him he might be misunderstanding what he had seen. The emotional part was already losing the argument. That evening, Rowan returned home exhausted. The townhouse felt colder than usual. He wandered upstairs and entered the spare bedroom. The suitcase still sat where he had left it. Slowly, he opened it. A few shirts, pair of jeans, a sweater. Nothing dramatic, nothing impulsive. Just enough to test how it felt. As he folded clothes into the suitcase, a sudden wave of dizziness forced him to sit down on the edge of the bed. He pressed a hand against his stomach and closed his eyes. The strange fatigue had been growing for weeks. He had blamed stress, lack of sleep, anxiety, but deep down, another possibility had begun to surface. One he had been avoiding, one he was not yet ready to face. Downstairs, the front door opened. Callum had come home. Rowan looked at the half-packed suitcase and quietly zipped it closed before anyone could see it. Several days passed, and the distance between Rowan and Callum became impossible to ignore. They still shared the same house. They still sat at the same table. They still exchanged polite conversations about groceries, bills, and schedules. Yet the warmth that once defined their marriage seemed trapped behind an invisible wall. Every night, Rowan found himself studying Callum when he was not looking, searching for signs that would prove his fears wrong. Instead, he kept finding reasons to doubt. On Friday afternoon, Rowan finally scheduled an appointment with his doctor. The fatigue had not disappeared. Neither had the dizziness. Part of him hoped the visit would provide a simple explanation. Stress. Exhaustion. Anything ordinary. The clinic sat near the edge of downtown Portland, overlooking the river. Rain clouds gathered above the water as Rowan sat in the examination room waiting for results. When Dr. Harris entered, she carried a warm smile and a thin folder. "Congratulations," she said gently. Rowan blinked. "Excuse me? You are expecting?" For a moment, the room went completely silent. Rowan stared at her, unable to process the words. Then emotion rushed through him all at once. Shock, fear, joy, confusion. His hand instinctively moved to his stomach. The world suddenly felt larger and smaller at the same time. Dr. Harris continued explaining timelines, appointments, and recommendations, but Rowan barely heard any of it. One thought repeated itself over and over. Callum was going to be a father. Under different circumstances, the news would have been the happiest moment of their lives. Instead, Rowan left the clinic carrying a mixture of hope and heartbreak. He sat in his car for nearly 20 minutes staring at the steering wheel. He imagined telling Callum. He imagined the smile that might appear, the excitement, the plans they would make together. Then another image surfaced. The text message. The countdown. Dr. Evelyn Mercer. The marked date on the calendar. The hidden lockbox. Slowly, the hopeful vision faded. What if Callum no longer wanted this life? What if he was already preparing to leave? Rowan could not bring himself to risk hearing those answers aloud. That evening, he stopped at a small pharmacy on the way home. The paper bag felt strangely heavy in his hands. When he arrived at the townhouse, Callum was not there. Again, a message waited on his phone. Running late. Do not wait for dinner. Rowan stared at the screen for a long time. Then he climbed the stairs and entered the closet where he had hidden the black lockbox. The envelope remained tucked beneath the handle. Trust me a little longer. For months. For more months. Rowan shook his head. He could not live inside uncertainty any longer. Sitting on the floor, he examined the lock carefully. Along one side, he noticed a manufacturer label and a small emergency release panel. It would not be easy to open. But suddenly, for the first time, Rowan was no longer certain he intended to wait. Somewhere inside that box were answers. And after learning he was carrying a child, answers had become more important than promises. Chapter 3. When Time Runs Out. The lockbox. 2 nights later, the house was silent except for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Callum had left before sunrise for another business trip, or at least that was what he had called it. Rowan no longer knew which explanations were true and which were simply convenient. The black lockbox sat on the dining room table beneath a warm pool of light from the overhead fixture. For nearly an hour, Rowan stared at it. Every instinct told him he was crossing a line. Every memory of Callum's handwritten request urged him to wait. But another thought had become impossible to ignore. He was no longer making decisions only for himself. He placed a protective hand over his stomach and closed his eyes. Then he reached for the small emergency release panel he had discovered earlier. The process took longer than expected. Several attempts failed. More than once, Rowan nearly gave up. Then, with a soft click, the lock finally released. The sound seemed unnaturally loud inside the empty house. Rowan slowly lifted the lid. He immediately froze. The box was filled with envelopes. 12 of them, each one neatly arranged and labeled by hand. The 1st birthday, the 5th birthday, the 10th birthday, graduation day, first heartbreak, wedding day. Rowan's breath caught. His hands began to shake. He pulled out another envelope. Then another. Every label described a future milestone. Future moments. Future memories. Not for Rowan. For a child. Confusion crashed into him. He sat down heavily in the nearest chair and stared at the collection spread across the table. There were also several notebooks, legal folders, and sealed documents beneath the envelopes. One notebook rested on top of the stack. The cover carried only a single sentence written in Callum's handwriting. If you are reading this, then I ran out of time. Rowan felt as though the floor had disappeared beneath him. With trembling fingers, he opened the notebook. The first page contained a date nearly 7 months old. The entry was short. Today, Dr. Mercer confirmed what I already suspected. The condition is progressing faster than expected. I have 4 months to prepare everything. Rowan blinked repeatedly as he read the line again. Then another entry. And another. Each page revealed careful planning. trust funds, insurance policies, letters, recorded messages, educational accounts, detailed instructions for milestones that had not happened yet. There was no mention of divorce, no mention of another relationship, no mention of leaving Rowan. Every page revolved around one goal: protecting his family. A folded medical report slipped from between the pages and landed on the table. Rowan picked it up. His eyes scanned the first paragraph. The words blurred before finally settling into focus. Severe hereditary cardiac condition. High risk. Experimental surgical intervention recommended. Rowan covered his mouth. Dr. Evelyn Mercer. The appointments. The secrecy. The countdown. Suddenly every piece fit together in a way he had never imagined. Tears filled his eyes. Not because Callum had betrayed him, because Callum had been preparing for the possibility that he might not survive long enough to see the future he wanted with Rowan. And for the first time, Rowan realized he had misunderstood everything. The notebook remained open on the table long after midnight. Rowan sat surrounded by letters, medical reports, and carefully organized plans for a future Callum feared he might never see. Every page felt like a confession written in silence. Every document revealed another sacrifice Rowan had never known existed. The text message that had shattered his trust suddenly carried an entirely different meaning. Just a few more months, then I am done. Callum had not been counting down to the end of their marriage. He had been counting down to the completion of everything he believed Rowan and their future child might need if the surgery failed. Tears slipped down Rowan's face as he continued reading. One entry described how Callum had secretly met with financial advisors to secure long-term stability. Another explained the educational funds. Another detailed renovations he wanted completed before the baby's arrival, even though he did not know a baby already existed. The realization broke Rowan's heart all over again. Callum had been preparing for a child he only dreamed about while Rowan was already carrying one. At sunrise, Rowan made a decision. He could not wait any longer. He needed to tell Callum the truth. He needed to tell him about the baby. He needed to tell him he knew everything. But when Rowan reached for his phone, an incoming call appeared first. Dr. Evelyn Mercer. Confused, Rowan answered. Rowan? Her voice sounded strained. I am sorry to contact you directly, but I think you need to come to St. Vincent Medical Center. Rowan's entire body went cold. Why? A brief silence followed. Callum was admitted early this morning. The drive felt endless. Rain hammered against the windshield while traffic lights blurred through Rowan's tears. By the time he reached the hospital parking garage, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely turn off the engine. Inside the cardiology wing, Dr. Mercer met him near a private waiting area. She looked exhausted. He did not want you involved until everything was finalized, she explained softly. He thought he was protecting you. Rowan laughed bitterly through tears. That sounds exactly like him. Dr. Mercer guided him toward a large observation window overlooking a recovery corridor. The procedure is scheduled sooner than expected, she said quietly. Rowan looked through the glass. At the far end of the hallway, Callum sat alone beside a hospital room window. Morning light illuminated his profile. For the first time in months, Rowan could see the truth hidden beneath the secrets. Callum looked tired, fragile, human, not like a man preparing to leave his family, like a man desperately trying to stay with them. And suddenly Rowan understood that time was running out far faster than either of them had realized. Rowan stood outside the hospital room for several seconds before finally pushing the door open. Callum looked up from the chair beside the window, surprise flashing across his face. For a moment neither of them spoke. Months of misunderstanding, fear, and silence filled the space between them. Then Rowan crossed the room and placed the notebook from the lockbox on the small table beside Callum. Color drained from Callum's face. You found it, he said quietly. Rowan nodded. I found all of it. Callum closed his eyes. Rowan, I can explain. I know. Rowan's voice trembled. That is the problem. I finally know. Tears gathered in Callum's eyes. I never wanted you to carry this burden. Rowan let out a soft laugh filled with heartbreak. Instead, you carried it alone. Neither man could hide the truth anymore. For the first time in months, they talked honestly. Rowan told him about the text message, the calendar, Dr. Mercer, the fears that had slowly convinced him their marriage was ending. Callum listened in stunned silence. Then he explained everything. The diagnosis had arrived almost 8 months earlier. The surgery carried risks, and he had become obsessed with making sure Rowan would be protected no matter what happened. Every late night, every secret meeting, every hidden document had been part of that plan. "I thought I was helping you," Callum admitted. "I thought if the worst happened, you would never have to worry." Rowan shook his head. "You were never supposed to protect me from the truth. We were supposed to face it together." Then he took Callum's hand and placed it gently against his stomach. Confusion crossed Callum's face. A second later, realization followed. His eyes widened. "Rowan?" Rowan smiled through tears. "You are going to be a father." For a moment Callum could not speak. Then he broke completely. Years of control and restraint vanished as he pulled Rowan into his arms. They sat together by the window as morning sunlight slowly filled the room. A week later, the surgery took place. The hours felt endless, but when the surgeon finally entered the waiting area, the news was good. The procedure had been successful. Recovery would take time, but Callum was expected to live a long life. 3 years later, laughter filled the backyard of their Portland home. A small boy with Rowan's smile and Callum's gray eyes chased bubbles across the grass while his parents watched from the patio. The lockbox still existed, but it sat unopened in the attic. It was no longer a symbol of loss. It was a reminder that love could survive fear, that truth mattered more than silence, and that sometimes the future people almost lost became even more precious when they finally reached it together.